Well, Frank Davis, thank you for joining us on the Millhouse.
Well, thanks for having me.
You know, I've always wanted to have a voice from Boca Grande Pass and the fisheries here, that Professional Tarpon Tournament Series that was shut down. I think you were a big part of it. But let's go back a little bit before we get into your life and your influence here. If you take a look at the history of Boca Grande, it became really famous back in the 1800s. 1885, they caught the very first, I think it was Herbert something Wood. What was his name? I can't think of it. His last name was Wood. He caught a 93-pound tarpon, which is actually the very first big game fish caught on rod and reel.
Right.
And he was so excited, he put it on ice and drove it to New York. Do you remember that story?
I do. I remember that being part of what started big game fishing in the world, or in this part of the country anyway. So,
yeah. So in 1910, Boca Grande had all kinds of people. It was really, really hot and heavy with tarpon. Wherever you go, restaurants and hotels, there are tarpon on the wall. You know, so the attention was really big. I think most likely you could say this is the tarpon capital of the world.
Well, it's got the reputation as being that, and when the railroad came to the island, that brought all the northern visitors, and then the hotel opened, and then property became more valuable, and but it is known as the world's greatest tarpon fishing. It's a place where you can just about guarantee you're going to catch a tarpon.
Right. Yeah.
If you put your time in.
I think the Keys call themselves the fishing capital of the world.
Yes.
But when you
I think that's just from the diversity, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you catch swordfish and bonefish and redfish, everything.
Yeah, but this is tarpon country. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your history here and your family.
Well, I was born in Arcadia, just a little town 40 miles north of here, and my dad had a hardware store in Arcadia, and he had brought the first propane gas service in bottled tanks to the area, and he saw the potential in that, and he bought a place in Belglade, Florida, a storage facility with rail that he serviced not only residential but the whole agricultural community. And we moved from Arcadia to Belglade, Florida in 65, 66. And that business helped him buy a place in Boca Grande and build his dream home. And they built their dream home in 81. But we came to Boca Grande every summer and every weekend as long as I can remember, since the mid-60s.
Do you remember? I mean, I've got some notes here. You used to run to school in your own boat.
Well, I never did that. In high school, I went to high school in Belglade and graduated from there, and then went on to college and moved back to Boca Grande in 81 after my parents had built the house. After I graduated in college in agribusiness and agri-science, and I become a fishing guide.
Right.
Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But I never actually, now the school children back in the 60s did go by boat to school. They collected them in the outer islands of Cape Costa, Giuseppe, and they all came to the island school in Boca Grande.
When did you first fishing come into your life? Was your dad a big fisherman?
I am the only fishing guide in the family.
But you said you came here a lot with your dad fishing.
Yes. My dad when he was growing up in Arcadia, came here every chance he got and fished off the bridges or fished with a friend in a boat, and they'd spend all night every weekend and then get up early and go back to work on Monday morning. And that's what we did as kids, as children growing up. We would come here after work on Fridays from Belglade, stay all weekend, and get up at 5 a.m. on Monday so we could be back in time for school and Dad for work.
So it was in your heart at a very young age.
Absolutely.
But then you became involved with marlin tournaments and running big boats.
Back when I first moved back to Boca Grande in the early 80s, when I graduated college, I took a job as a mate on a 60-foot Hatteras. And that was just going to be part-time. And it was going to be a fun gig for the summer. And then I was going to get real about my ag career, because I had a job already waiting for me in with the sugar industry in Belglade. And because I had done an internship in college.
Right.
And they were waiting for me. And I said, no, I'm not ready yet. So I took that job as a mate and ended up doing that for 4.5 years. And then I decided I'm not going to work for the sugar industry. I'm going to stay here. And after the mate job, I got my captain's license and went up to Mobile, Alabama. I had actually moved up there to do a job for a seed and fertilizer company to give my ag background a try. I committed 1 year. On that 365th day, I said, see ya.
Well, fishing was in your blood. Boats were in your blood. Being on the ocean was in your blood. Because tell me about when you were 14 years old and you worked on a harbor pilot boat.
Well, growing up in Boca Grande in the 70s was like living on Fantasy Island. It was such a neat experience. When I was 14, I'd taken a job as a mate on the pilot boat for the harbor service when the phosphate was going in full blast. The oil dock was there, and they needed a mate to take the lines from the ships and take to these huge buoys that were as big as this table with a huge hook on them. And I'd take 4 on and 4 off, and I'd take this huge hawser line, pull it down, wrap it around a cleat. Pilot would go over there, and I'd jump off, put it on the hook, and jump back on.
Jump onto the buoy.
Onto the buoy. As a 14-year-old with that current going through Boca Grande Pass.
And it was a little irresponsible from somebody, not yours.
I was scared to death.
Oh, you were?
Oh,
yeah. What was the captain saying to you? Just do this. Yeah, just jump off and...
Hey,
hold on.
I said, no big deal. Just jump up there, and bird crap everywhere. You're slipping and sliding, and then they're pulling that cable, and that buoy's turning like that. And you're going, oh, God.
Right.
Don't fall off.
I mean, but was this normal for the young kids to be, working on these pilot boats?
Yeah.
Doing this?
Yep.
And when did it stop? When did the first kid die?
No. It would have been me, trust me, if it would have happened. But never an injury, never fell in the water. And doing that, and also is being the mate on the boat, which you took care of the boat and checked everything for the captain before he came on board. And it was really special seeing all these ships come in from all over the world. And you never knew. At one point, there'd be 6 or 7 ships anchored up in the harbor. Japan, Russia, China, who knows? They were from all over the world. It was really a neat experience as a young kid doing that.
Yeah.
Tell us about that railroad. My father and I, when we were driving down here, said that there was a railroad that took people from Philadelphia straight to Boca Grande.
Absolutely. When they opened up the railroad to Boca Grande, that Boca Grande became discovered, and it became
early 1900s.
Early 1900s,
right?
And it became known as a fishing destination. Then it was the place to go if you wanted to catch a tarpon, and the rail. Then when they established the phosphate port, because they were digging phosphate in Arcadia, it was closer to here than it was to Tampa. And then that opened up a whole nother part of the island. The south end of the island where the phosphate port was like its own little city. It was a whole different zip code.
So they'd mine the phosphate and load the phosphate onto ships coming in for transportation elsewhere.
They would load them on the trains, and the train would bring the phosphate in, unload it in storage facilities on the south end of the island.
Right.
And then there was this huge, I've got a picture in my office, there's a huge conveyor belt that came from that storage facility, and it just ran it up to a big hopper on the ships, and then they just load the ships, just move it up and down the ship.
What they use phosphate for?
Cosmetics, toothpaste, fertilizer, number of things, and they still, to this day, paint.
They're still mining over here?
Absolutely.
And they're still using the south side of the island to...
No, the southern end of the island closed down in 1976, 77. The last train left in 1978. That was it. They shut it down because it wasn't feasible. They were hitting more pits, so to speak, closer to Tampa, and then that opened up Tampa to be the main port instead of Boca Grande.
Right. Were there any environmental issues regarded with the phosphate pit?
You know, it was when that phosphate operation was going full blast, there was dust flying everywhere. There was a sheen on the water. And we're out there tarpon fishing all this, and it never affected anything. We were catching redfish and snook off the dock when everything was in full operation. And there was tons of that spilled in the water. I mean, tons of it. Never bothered a thing because the current was so swift through that pass. It never settled. It never settled.
Before we get into the more of the tarpon stuff, let's go back to mating on a billfish boat. And then you were a captain. You won a bunch of these tournaments. You know, if you talk to a lot of guys in the fishing world, a lot of them started out as mates. What was that evolution as a mate to captain?
When I first started on that 60-footer, I'd never done anything like that before, and I didn't know if it was something that I was gonna like or pursue, but it just fit, and I loved it so much that I ended up. The captain on the boat was an absolute fantastic mentor of mine, and he's still around. Johnny Johnson. He was just an incredible guy. He taught me everything: how to run big boats, how to maintain them, how to rig baits, how to do everything. And we traveled to Panama City, we traveled to the Keys, and it just was a learning curve for me, basically on my own. And if I saw people that I knew in our travels and say, "What are you doing? You know what?" And they'd show me, and I'd just watch and learn. I kind of taught myself, basically. But I loved it so much, I moved on to get my captain's license, and I started running boats. I ran a boat out of St. Pete, and then up in Destin, excuse me. That's when I won my first tournament. Marlin tournament was in Destin in 1985 as a 25-year-old. That was pretty special. We caught the only blue marlin in the tournament too, by the way.
Wow.
But it was coming off of a huge tropical depression, and we were one of the only idiots that stayed out.
How many boats were in that tournament?
There were, I think, 80 boats in that tournament.
Wow. And what did you win? What was the prize?
We won, it was over $100,000, about $120,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So as a 25-year-old, that was pretty exciting.
You didn't party that night, did you?
They all laugh when you say that, Niggy.
Maybe just a little bit.
How'd you go from big boats and winning marlin tournaments to fishing the pass?
Well, we had fished the pass in those big boats that I was a mate on. Or
60-foot Hatterases.
60. Listen, back in that day, back in the 80s, there were 70-footers out there, 60, 70, 50-footers out there. The Miss Budweiser, a beautiful 61 Rabovich was out there. They came every year, entertained clients. Big boats, fished that pass, and never had a problem. Always caught fish.
How'd they not bump into each other with all that current?
It was close. It was close. It was amazing how well the guides worked together and with those big boats. Now, it'd get hairy sometimes, but when someone hooked a fish, everyone gave them space.
Right.
Got out of the way, gave them space, and they still do that today.
And how many boats back then were fishing the pass?
Oh, my God. There'd be 40, 50 boats out there at any given
Big
time.
boats?
Big boats. Yep.
And what is it today?
Well, this was the place where they all came to entertain their clients and do business deals.
Mm-hmm.
Boca Grande was it. And the Gasparilla Inn was to capacity. And it was a destination. And like I said, you could almost guarantee someone was going to catch a tarpon when you came to Boca Grande Pass.
It was so big that a lot of presidents came here.
Absolutely.
Thomas Edison caught his first tarpon here and ended up having a home, I think, in Marco Island.
Yep. Yep. President
Bush, a good friend of mine, and his whole family, I think they're still coming here. George W.
They do. Yep.
Thomas Edison came here?
Yeah.
Huh.
Thomas Edison caught a fish here and ended up owning a home, I think it was in Marco Island or Naples.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get a lot of celebrities, a lot of sports, athletes, coaches. They love it here.
Right.
I think it's because they know they can come here and not get harassed. because it's just like
It's a small little island.
they're just like everyday people, just like we are.
Right.
And back when those big boats were fishing the past, were they fishing live bait crabs?
Yeah.
They weren't
Yeah.
the jig fishermen, the coon pop.
It was all live bait then, crab, shrimp, squirrelfish. It was all live bait.
Does it only work on an falling tide over there?
No, I mean, if it's incoming, outgoing,
Either tide.
Either tide.
You could catch them.
as long as it's moving, and obviously if you're not moving, your bait's not going anywhere. Now, you'll still catch them, don't get me wrong, but it's better when it's moving.
But it also, too, the boat's got to stay above your bait,
Yes.
so there's no angle of your line into the water.
Well, in theory.
In theory.
Yeah.
That's what you want, but it's hard to do.
With that current, there's some bow in the line. There has to be. And that's why we mark our lines, too, so we don't hook bottom.
Right.
And it was always easy for the angler. It's simple for the angler to come because you hit the mark on the reel. It's all marked 42 and 60 feet, which is the majority of the ledges in the pass. And it's just, easy, laid back, gentleman's fishing. And of course, when the hookup turns into game on.
Right.
But it was just a place where everybody came to play, and they knew they wouldn't get harassed.
Do you know who first started the pass fishing?
Oh God,
I mean, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure there will be plenty of them that'll claim that.
Right.
But I think it goes back to the original families like the Futches and the Colemans and the Wheelers. The railroad people were also guide trips as well when they had in between, ships or shifts or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they'd be out there in these old wooden boats with old office chairs that they converted into fighting chairs. It was really great to see. And I caught the very tail end of that.
When did they start dispersing these boats and fishing the backcountry and the beaches and all that? Back then also?
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't as many people fishing the beaches in the back bay, and fly fishing really wasn't popular back in that time. I mean, it was, but it was a well-kept secret.
Right.
The beaches became popular probably in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, more popular. And there's some old-timers that'll tell you that was the worst thing that ever could have happened to them. But in the back bay, the same thing. It became more and more popular because I think people got tired of the congestion of the pass and they wanted to do something different.
Right.
And they liked doing the beach or doing up to the harbor.
When Homosassa was in its prime, the late 70s, early 80s, when everyone was down up there fly fishing, was this a prolific fly fishing spot back then?
Yes.
It was?
Yes.
Who was like one of the first pioneers around Boca Grande fly fishing?
I'm going to probably say Phil O'Bannon.
Right.
Was probably one of the first ones to get it started. And then it just kind of bled on to others that not many out-of-towners came to fly fish. They came to pass fish.
Right.
And so the fly fishing was kept a pretty good secret for years.
I fished it here once in like 88. I was fishing in Boca Grande, I was fishing in Homosassa with Tommy Locke. We hadn't seen a fish in like 4 days. I said, Tommy, I can ski at 90, but I can't fish at 0. Hadn't seen a fish. I said, let's go to Boca Grande. I want to see that place. So we trailered down here, went to lunch, had a hamburger, bought 12 crabs. And we went out to the pass, and he showed me how to fish the pass. And then I was fishing with a spinning rod, and all of a sudden we got outside. He said, there's some fish on the outside. We get out there. And we were surrounded by a school. We were in the middle of a donut that there had to have been hundreds and hundreds of fish inside this, circling our boat. And you throw your crab out there, and you can see the fish coming around. Every cast, we hooked 12 tarpon. Mm-hmm. It was like, wow, how cool is this? But I think that the evolution of the sport, and this is why I really wanted to get you on the podcast. I wanted to talk to you about the evolution of the jig fishing, the tournaments over there, the TV tournament that you guys got canceled. So let's go back to the pass. Who started the jig fishing, and why was that so popular?
I remember when 2 local guides came to me and showed me this jig.
Was that called a coon pop?
Well, it was designed after the coon pop, but it was different.
And what was the coon pop?
The coon pop was the Cajuns, the Louisiana, used that, and they trolled it. They didn't fish it straight up and down. It was used as a trolling lure, and that's how they caught their tarpon. And it had a longer tail and a hook back into the tail, with a round head.
A big weighted head.
Big weighted head.
Circle hook.
And circle hook.
Yeah, and a rubberized tail.
Yes.
Okay.
But it was trolled. It was pulled behind the boat and trolled like a marlin lure. And that's how they caught their tarpon.
And were they snagged or were they caught in the mouth?
They were caught. Those fish,
Yeah, when you're trolling.
to my knowledge, they were caught.
Yeah.
These guys brought this rig to me in the early, like late 80s. Yeah, it was the late 80s, early 90s. And I said, what do you think of this? And if I'd have known then what I know now, I'd have said, no, God, please don't even try this. Don't even. But it just looked like, my first impression with that, I said, I'm not going to catch anything off of that.
Nobody's going to bite that.
Thing.
And I said that too. Nobody's going to bite that thing.
Nobody's going to bite that. It was a short tail, big round head, and the hook was right on top of the lead. So
and it was the head was a red weight.
Yeah.
Like a ball.
Yeah, it was a ball. There were 4 or 6 ounce lead, and they either painted them red or yellow, some green, and the tail was like a tiger tail pattern. But the hook was right on top of the lead, right on top of it. I said, "What are you doing?"
It was tied on with like a tie strap, right?
It was tied on with a zip tie.
Zip tie.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So it was a breakaway. And as live bait guys, we fish with breakaway leads too. It was just safer around the boat, which that law has since changed, and I'll get back to that. But when they showed me this, I went, have at it. I never thought it would have grown into the disaster it grew into. Let's put it that way, for lack of a better term. Because these fish were, they would go out there, and we'd be out on a trip, and the fish would stop biting, and we're drifting and drifting and drifting. Nothing. These guys would come out with that rig, and they're flying fish all over the place. I'm going, are you kidding me? What is it about this that there's no way? So we started trying it. We said, okay, we've got to try this. So we'd get some jigs and we'd try them, but they were hooked on the side in the clipper, under the chin, in the belly, in the side pecs. And I said, wait a minute, something's going on here.
And this lasted for years.
Years. And we got to do something about this. And it got worse and worse and worse, where how you're fishing next to somebody and you may be using the same thing that they are, and they're catching more fish than you are, and they're kind of snickering at you. And these guys were kind of getting belligerent, and they were making us look bad because the bite's over. I mean, we've caught plenty of fish, don't get me wrong, but the bite is over. And they come around the corner, and here's all these boats gathering all over the fish, and all of a sudden they're flying everywhere. Also,
a snagged fish takes longer to land. So now you have a long duration, to land them. The fish get tired, and then they get shark bit. If I'm not mistaken, that was like a red flag at that early in that stage, or did it come later?
Well, our observation was that a foul hooked fish always goes with the current. Always goes with the current. It never goes back against the current like a fish hooked in the mouth would. Now, don't get me wrong, some of them do go with the current, but these foul hooked fish always went with the current. And they'd be fighting these fish with lighter tackle for way too long. And the fish would almost be dead by the time they got it up. And of course, a shark, if it didn't get eaten by a shark, it was going to die anyway. And we were seeing more and more fatality, and especially in the tournaments. When they gaff the fish. Now, we used to gaff fish too in the tournaments, but we quit. We stopped doing that because we were seeing a mortality rate. After every tournament and the weekends, there'd be dead fish all over the harbor and in the pass.
So let's go back to the tournament. So you gaff the fish, throw it in the boat, and go weigh it?
Well, they would never throw it in the boat. They would lip gaff the fish.
So you're talking about lip gaffing, lip gaffing.
Lip gaff.
And drag them over to a boat that had a weigh station on
Yes.
it. Okay.
Yeah. And they'd hoist them up in a sling, weigh it with a digital scale, and then pop it back in the water and try to revive it. But
you take a fish out of the water, it's toast.
well, tarpon being a suction feeder, now it's got a hole in its lower jaw. Mm-hmm. Can't feed properly.
I can't believe the tournament didn't have a set of rules that said the hook has got to be in the mouth.
Okay, well, after pressure, they decided that was going to be a rule.
So when you won this tournament, world's richest tarpon tournament, that was the technique and tactics.
The first year, 94, we gaffed them.
Okay.
When I won in 94.
Was it jig fishing or bait only?
There was both. There was both styles of fishing were allowed then.
Did you jig fish at the time, or were you baiting only?
No, it was traditional live bait.
So that must have been harder to win than the guys that were jig fishing, because it's a traditional way you're not snagging fish.
Right. And it wasn't when we were seeing what was happening, then it was instated in the rules that no jigs were allowed, live bait only. And then the jig guys quit fishing the tournament, or they either just fish with live bait, and that was it.
Right.
So it was, and then these other set of tournaments came in, and that was a whole nother situation.
So let's go back a little bit. How long did it take you guys to ban the jig fishing?
2.5 years.
But it had been in existence for how long before you said we got to stop this?
10 or more years.
Right.
Yeah. What happened was not only us as fishing guides saw the reality of what was happening, but local islanders, especially down at the park at the south end, the caretaker of the lighthouse, after each tournament, they would see dead fish of these jig tournaments. They'd see dead fish on the beach and up in the harbor, and they all had a hole in their lower jaw, so you know where they were coming from.
Right.
So we decided, enough's enough. We got to do something about this. And it took 2.5 years and a lawsuit and a lot of money, but we got it banned.
Who was suing you? The jig fisherman?
Well, the owner of the tournament was suing us.
Right.
And sued myself and 4 others personally, and the organization that we formed at the time called Save the Tarpon as a corporation as well.
And how did it go to court? How did you get it banned?
Well, we had a lot of help from the Florida Wildlife Commission. Finally, they decided that this was not a jig, it was a foul hooking device. Mm-hmm. After we took thousands of pictures. We had photographers go out and film these tournaments and see where these fish, jigs are everywhere. They're all over the place. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes they were in the mouth, but we even did a hook placement study. FWC did a hook placement study one year, and they found that over 70% of jig caught fish were hooked outside the mouth.
Right.
Live bait, only 1% that happened. Only 1%. So Ken Wright, who was the head commissioner at the time of Florida Wildlife Commission, was very instrumental in getting this ban. And they voted on it, and it was unanimous that was a snagging device.
Well, it sounds like the problem is twofold. One, you have a snagging device, and two, you were lip gaffing them with a big old hole in the mouth.
Well, here's what happened. FWC was giving them extra points for DNA swabs, or the tournament was giving them extra points if you DNA swab that fish and send it in for scientific purposes. When we were finding all these dead fish, I went back on the weekend or the weekday after these tournaments and found all these dead fish. So I DNA swabbed them too, and guess what? They all matched.
Interesting.
So they knew they had a problem. Then they quit. All of a sudden, they quit DNA swabbing the fish.
So let me ask you: how can a DNA fish? Can you tell the difference between a DNA dead fish was caught with a jig versus a live bait?
Same thing. No difference. DNA is DNA, whether it's dead or alive.
Mm-hmm. But why? So why were you taking DNA swabs?
Just to see if it was the fish in the tournament.
To prove that they were harming these fish. See, because every one of those fish had a hole in their lower jaw.
But weren't those people recreational people fishing out there, or did it close to recreational people during the tournament?
They actually had, when their tournaments were going on, they actually had hired off-duty FWC officers that were known that if people came in and tried to fish during those tournaments, no.
They ran them off.
They ran them off.
So obviously it was all...
That was terrible.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting is the Gold Cup, the Golden Fly, those two tarpon tournaments and the Keys, you still are allowed to use a lip gaff, which really? I find very interesting.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people do it, but they haven't
I don't know of anybody that's using a lip gaff.
I know a couple people.
Well, we quit doing that years and years ago and went to an all-release format for our tournaments. Mm-hmm. I think that stopped in the mid-'90s. We stopped gaffing fish. Late 90s. Mm-hmm. We stopped gaffing. Said, that's it. All releases. No more gaffing fish. And so we tried to set a precedent for them to follow, which they didn't. But we never televised our tournaments either. We never were for profit for anything.
Right.
So we didn't need that. But, to televise something, you got to have the drama, I guess. And that's what happened.
So that was the Professional Tarpon Tournament Series.
Yes.
We saw that on TV. Talk about that devastation.
Well, in live bait, when we're live bait fishing, we always, in the main purpose of using, which you saw on my boat out there, an inboard boat, the exhaust is above the water. And you go ahead of the fish and drift back through and presenting your bait. You didn't get a bite. Everybody went around and came back through. The jig fishing boats were all outboards. And the traditional guides in Boca Grande called them ass grinders. And that just stuck. It just stuck for years, because if you ever heard of you've been under the water when an outboard goes in and out of gear. Have you heard that in the water? It travels forever. And the sound when they go into gear, you can hear it for hundreds of yards. You can hear it. If you ever just want to test that, you're at the beach or something and an outboard goes by, stick your hand on the water and listen to that sound. It's very unique.
So then there was a war that was being waged between the old school and the new school guys.
That's basically, but what these guys would do is there would be 40, 50 boats, all outboards, and they'd go mark their fish and they'd sit right on top of them and constantly in and out of gear, harassing these fish, putting these jigs down. And before we got a law passed, this was another thing. They'd have 6 or 8 rods overboard, just 3 on each side. And all these lines down there just harassing these fish constantly. And all that noise, and then they're flying fish are snagged. So we did get a rule passed at only 3 rods at a time. That helped. But it still didn't help with them gaffing the fish and then dragging him to the weigh scale and basically holding him out of the water. I mean, 150-pound class fish. I mean, they were going after big females. Because you think the big females tend to stay lower on the bottom, and they would hook those big fish, putting those jigs down on the bottom. And another thing, they'd lose a lot of terminal tackle, so the pass became a dumping ground. Mm-hmm. It literally became a dumping ground. And we hired divers every year to come in and just go get what they could and clean up.
Sinkers, jigs, monofilament.
And monofilament doesn't rot takes hundreds of years. So that was a mess.
Just out of curiosity, how was that tournament? What were the tournament rules? Did you get any points for leadering a fish, or?
Yeah.
You did?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then it was just a overall weight of the fish.
Yeah.
And did you have 5 fish limit, or what was?
No, see, in their tournament, I think you could weigh as many fish as long as you thought you could. No. Once you weighed a fish, that was it. I'm sorry. If you thought you had a big fish, you weighed it, that's it. And you take a chance of someone else catching a bigger fish and getting beat out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so one boat only you had 1 fish per boat.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, to weigh.
Interesting.
And that was over a course of a couple of days?
They usually had one day
tournaments.
Yeah.
And what kind of prize money was there?
There wasn't much prize money. It was more prizes like boats, watches, jewelry, stuff like that. I don't think there was a whole lot of money involved, but it was product.
And a lot of pride. I know you mentioned that when you won this tournament in 2021, the richest tarpon tournament in the world, you guys won over $100,000.
Well, that was in '94.
That was the first one you won.
That was the first one I won.
Well, that's a lot of money back then.
That was a lot of money.
A lot of money now.
Yeah.
But what did it do for your career?
Unbelievable. If you won that tournament, it boosted your career. You were booked, period. You were the king of the hill for a year. I mean, it's like winning the Daytona 500.
Maybe for a lifetime of your career.
It lasted a while. And then I didn't win it again until 2014. And I placed third, a few times. Mm-hmm. But that first time in '94, when I was really getting my career going, that was the one to win.
Right. That just shows you how many people were tuned into this tournament. So they would just see it on TV that you won, or read it in the magazine and start calling you?
Well, like I said, they weren't televised, but the news, all the local news stations showed up.
Right.
And they interviewed you after the tournament, and it was
word of mouth too.
It was a big thing. Mm-hmm. It was huge.
When did you start having the feel for conservation and starting to feel a concern for these fish?
Probably when we saw what was happening with this jig tournament and what they were doing.
Right.
And seeing all these dead fish after every tournament. That's when I said, we got to do something. Mm-hmm. We have to. And, when you see dead fish, that many, I mean, it wasn't just one or two, it was a lot. And it would be big fish.
All of the fish they weighed. Most, like 90% of them, I bet.
And most of them were big females, mm-hmm. Because that's where the money was. You need to catch that big female. And, we saw a decline in the fishery because they were killing these big females. And, there for a while, our fishery was really starting to go downhill. And that's another reason that said, okay, we have to do something. Because the fishery in Boca Grande was, one year they just went on by. They didn't even stop. I mean, they came back, but it was a terrible season. And I think that was in the early 2000s. It was terrible. I go, oh, God, what are we going to do? So we stepped up, and the whole community stepped up. Let me tell you, Boca Grande as a community stepped up and asked us what we needed, and they gave. Mm-hmm. They gave.
One of the things I've always been interested in, being a Keys fisherman, and I did fish here at one time, but there's all this Instagram stuff over the years where these captains and anglers were hanging on the tarpon and the sharks were eating, their tails off. And all the guys that fish Homosassa were always complaining that we don't have the fish because Boca Grande sharks are eating everything.
Yep.
How prevalent are the sharks, and how damaging are those sharks to the mass?
Well, I think another part of that, with live bait fishing, our fight times average 7 to 12 minutes. That's it. I mean, we're using heavier tackle.
Right.
And you still get the juice of the fight. I mean, don't get me wrong. And sometimes they're longer. They'll go 20 or so minutes. I mean, but we're using, 100-pound Dacron and 100-pound leaders too. The jig fishermen were fighting their fish longer, promoting more shark attacks. And we saw an increase when these tournaments were at their height. The shark population, it seemed like doubled. And because they had an easy meal.
Right.
Sharks are bad every year. They follow the tarpon here. And it seems like the beginning of the season in late April and May, they're bad, mostly bull sharks. And then they get filled. It seems like they get their fill and they move on. And then you won't have a shark attack for 2 months. Mm-hmm. And then later in the season, they always come back. And that's when the bull and the tiger sharks, the hammerheads and the tiger sharks show up.
Why do these tarpon congregate into the pass?
For as long as anyone's been keeping records, they come here to feed because all the food that comes out, we have the Peace River and the Mayaca River that empties into Charlotte Harbor, and that tidal current, especially around the moons, the new and full moons, that's when the crab run is the best. And the crabs will cover the water. Absolutely. You could walk on them.
Still today?
Still today.
Yeah.
Really?
It's amazing. And the tarpon they feed. They come here to feed before it pre-spawn. And then they leave here and go offshore and spawn.
They go offshore the full moon in May, like they do in the Keys?
Usually it's June. They wait till June. And I have been offshore 360, 70 feet and seen tarpon out there that far. Schools after schools of them. So that theory, I think, is very true. Where they come here, but they come to fatten up, and that's what they do.
Do you have any worm bars over here where they eat the Palolo worms under that big moon like they do in the Keys?
No. I wish we did, because I've heard that is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Now, we have this something weird that comes out of the pass that glows like a glowworm, and I've tried to net them, but they fall apart in your net. I don't know what they are.
I've seen that in Boca Raton Inlet. I've seen that.
No idea what that is.
Thousands of them.
Yeah,
and they're like luminescent and like glow, and it's crazy.
And you can't. They fall apart when you try to net one. So
do the fish eat them?
I don't know. I don't know, because there's so many crabs floating out at the time too that you see fish just popping these crabs everywhere. It's an incredible sight to see, and we have what's called the hill tide. I think you mentioned.
Right, I've been up there netting. You have little dip nets, and you net these crabs and put them on a hook and pitch them to the tarpon that are feeding them, just like a trout eating mayflies.
It's amazing. They leave the deep water of the pass and they go up in that 38, 35 feet of water with all those crabs coming out, and you can see them just pop, 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 pop.
It's so cool, right?
It is so cool.
It is.
And they still do that to this day.
How many boats get up on that hill pass?
There'll be quite a few. There'll probably be 30, 40 boats go up there. Mm-hmm. And it's tight, but if you get up there ahead of time, sometimes you get a couple of jump, but then once someone sees that, there they go. Mm-hmm. They all go. They see it.
Well, you just were in the Keys voicing your opinion about this new TV series that they were trying to get passed, Florida Sports Fishing Championships, and they wanted to fish Isla Morada, Sarasota, and Boca Grande. What did you see when you went to that meeting, the meeting of the minds of the fishermen, the locals in the Keys, and the tournament promoters?
When I got a call from Wesley Locke to come be at that tournament as a representative from Boca Grande, because she knew what we had gone through, and what she was actually here during that time, I think. It was a very impressive group. I mean, when you have that group of Bonefish Tarpon Trust, Captains for Clean Water, Upper Keys Guide Association, Lower Keys Guides, shop owners, and guides, I was pretty humbled to be in that group. But they all knew what I went through. And they all know that those fish are our fish and our fish are their fish. Those fish migrate this way. And they were very congratulatory, so to speak, as what I went through and what I did to get that championship banned. So I said, I'm on board. Whatever if you guys are against it, I'm against it. And they hammered those people pretty hard. Evidently, the CEO, the marketing director, and one of the secretaries showed up, and they were very gracious. But I think they had started this too late, and they threw something on the wall to see if it'd stick, and they weren't having it.
Right.
They weren't having it.
What is the future of tarpon fishing over here with so many boats and so much pressure and the sharks, the mayhem, if you will?
Well, we've always had the crowds. We've always had the sharks. I think the one thing that's hurting us now is our water quality. Mm-hmm. That's going to hurt us. Now, last year, we had the best tarpon season we've had in 10 years. It was amazing.
And why do you think that was?
I think it was partly getting this. We got that jig banned in 2004, I think. No, 14 maybe. Mm-hmm. I can't remember, but since then it's taken that long to get this fishery regenerated because of all these big fish that they killed.
Right.
And I mean, we were in double digits last year that we haven't been in 8 years on a trip. It was amazing. But we have a red tide now, and we never had a red tide in the wintertime. Never.
What's that mean? What's going to happen now?
I hope that we can get a lot of this. Well, one thing is Mosaic is proposing to dig phosphate along the Peace River. We've got it stopped now, but if they get their way and they're buying up all this property, all that runoff is going to go into the Peace River, come into the harbor, and it's just going to get worse. I'm really worried about all these red tides we're having.
Right.
It's very interesting. My father and I were just in Boca Grande Beach a couple of days ago, and we never experienced red tides. The guy we were with showed it to us. We walked to the beach, and we smelled it, and it tickles your throat. And
I started coughing immediately.
Immediately started coughing.
Yeah. That's what it does. It gets your respiratory system.
And it kills fish.
Yep.
It depletes all the oxygen out of the water.
Yep.
And it'll kill tarpon too.
Yep. I've seen dead tarpon. I've seen dolphins, manatees.
Wow.
It's been that bad. And we just seem to get it more often every year. As a kid growing up, I remember maybe every 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. But now it seems like we get it every year.
I mean, you just had Hurricane Ian come through here and devastated this place. I mean, you see all these trees that are down.
That didn't help.
You would think that the hurricanes would flush the water, flush the system.
The hurricane basically agitated it. Let's put it that way, agitated. It was offshore, and it brought it inshore. And if you look at the red tide charts now that FWC puts out, the worst is between Sarasota and Naples, all in this area. And throughout the years, it's been predominantly worse right here in that area between Sarasota and Naples. And I don't know if it's the rivers coming out here. We're at the Caloosahatchee South and Peace River and Mayaca River here. I don't know.
Yeah. Mother Nature, you can't dictate or forecast, what's going to happen.
Well, development doesn't help either.
Yeah, no kidding. Would you ever see a point in time where the pass would be closed and they'd call it a sanctuary?
They tried that. That was proposed.
Who tried that?
Well, when we were going through this jig live bait debate and war, they basically thought that we were calling Boca Grande Pass, it's ours, and we control it. Not true. So they said, well, we'll just propose to get it shut down because the island across the pass, Cape Costa, is a state park, and the southern tip of Boca Grande is a state park. And they said, well, why don't we just make the pass a state park, and you only fish certain times of the day, and it's closed at dark. That was going to open up a whole nother can of worms. And they talked about it pretty seriously. And I went, well, this is going to change the game. But it didn't happen.
Would you be for that?
If the old timers said when we started fishing at night, we didn't give the fish a break because they were getting fished all day and then again all night. I wouldn't be opposed to it. I mean, if they said, hey, you can't go out there at night, that'd change things for a lot of people and a lot of guides that are used to only fishing at night, because some only fish at night. But, if I don't know if I'd want it to be a state park, but maybe some regulations to that effect would be, maybe help.
It would cost a lot of people a fair amount of money because you used to run 3 and 4 trips a day.
Yep.
The whole island is based on tarpon fishing.
We used to
the
run,
economy is like $130 million a year right here.
Right. Yep. We used to run a 9 to noon trip, come in for lunch, go back 2 to 5, come back, take a little break, and go back and fish 7 to 10 or 7 to midnight, and do it all over again the next day.
Wow.
Yeah, that was
nonstop.
That's when I was a lot younger too. I can't do that now. I'll fish 1 trip a day now. That's it. But seeing some kind of regulation probably wouldn't hurt. But I think doing what we did in this battle and getting the pressure of a televised tournament away, because how when you're any tournament, you're under a different you have a different game face, no matter if it's televised or not. But then when you're televised, the pressure's on. You want to catch that big fish. You want to win. You want to be better than that other person. And you're going to do things you wouldn't normally do. Mm-hmm. And I think that pressure alone right there off of this fishery helped us tremendously. And letting the public know and the sponsors know that what they were doing to this fishery. And it was wrong. And they all agreed. I mean, the sponsors started pulling out like you wouldn't believe on this other deal that we did.
Right.
And I think this just recently happened too, that the sponsors were told what could happen if you televise. Live stream is what they were going to do, especially live stream right on a boat. And you could be exposing a site that we've been nurturing for years, and all of a sudden it's on live TV. That wasn't good.
So forecasting the tournament series of any sort of a tournament, you don't forecast a tournament ever happening again?
I don't think so. I think they're going to try again, but they tried. I think they put it out right at the tail end of when they were wanting to start this tournament, and it was just not
shut down.
It was shut down.
Yeah, certain locations just should not have tournaments. And this
now,
is one.
This FCS tournament, they had actually made Boca Grande Pass exempt in their fishing. So I went, okay, but what's that going to do with the rest of it? And I mentioned to them, I said, guys, there's a lot of times when all the fish in the area are in Boca Grande Pass. And if you guys are all outside of Boca Grande Pass, you don't catch anything.
And you're on television. What's
that going to do? Mm-hmm. You're going to open up Boca Grande Pass? Oh, no, we won't. Yes, you will. It happened before. Mm-hmm. So we got it nipped in the bud for now.
Good for you guys.
Yeah. Well, the Keys guys those guys weren't playing.
Right. Tell us about Betsy Bullard.
Oh,
a wonderful conservationist in the Florida Keys. Really a big voice of conservation. Tell us about the conversation that was taking place in Islamorada about this tournament series and her voice.
Betsy I don't know her that well. I've only met her a couple of times, but she is a no nonsense, in your face, I want you on my side type person. She did not cut any slack at all. And she basically told him what she thought about that tournament, and this is what I think you should do, and basically go away.
Was there any foul language?
No, I don't think I did hear any foul language.
Just a lot of fist pounding.
Well, maybe a couple, but there were some. You could feel the tension in the air in that meeting.
It was adamant. Is there anything that you'd like to add to this conversation?
Well, I think as far as the history in Boca Grande that we're trying to preserve and trying to keep history alive in Boca Grande, and the way it's done and the way it's always done. I mean, I'm fishing the way they fish for 100 years in Boca Grande, and it still works. And when you bring in a new entity or listen, getting that jig ban was huge. That was huge. I mean, I was ridiculed on the internet like you wouldn't believe. I was, oh, you're lying. You don't know what you're talking about. But standing up strong for what you believe in and preserving this great fish, I'm your man. I'm not going to sit by and watch this fiasco that was happening. It was horrible. I mean, and they were, the owner of the tournament, he said, and I'm not going to mention any names because he's local. Maybe I could, but he said, I'm going to stop when they tell me to stop. Well, we told him to stop. And I'm glad we did what we did because, like I said, last year was the best season we've had in 8 years. Mm. It's phenomenal. And I think it was part of what we did to get this fishery back in order.
Yeah, a lot of the big world record fish that were caught in Homosassa had tags on them that were tagged in Boca Grande.
Yep.
So if you do it correctly, these fish will survive.
Yeah. I was amazed at how far these fish travel, too. I mean, fish have been tagged in the Keys and show back up here in a day or two. Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
Right, and back in the Keys
And
like
back.
the next day. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
Locke
Tommy
tells that
Locke
story.
said, fish came down to Channel 5 and he was back into Boca Grande Pass by, 10 hours from then or so.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So, like Billy Pate, originally when BTT was started, Billy Pate asked that legendary question about Louisiana and everywhere else, Mexico.
I thought he asked that about Africa.
No, it was all about
Oh.
this circle here. He said, "Are our fish their fish and their fish our fish?"
Yep.
And that's why BTT started looking at the bigger spectrum,
Sure, yeah.
and doing the science to back it up.
Right, and they've done that a lot with bonefish in Belize and Bahamas.
Exactly
and
right.
Cuba.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that's why those guys were so interested in my opinion too, down in the Keys when I went down for that meeting. 'Cause I know those fish come from here. I mean, our fish come from that area.
And you saw the repercussions of these tournaments.
And those guys said last year was phenomenal too, from what I understand. Down in the Keys.
Yeah,
We're not guides, so we can't answer that question.
we're underground.
We suck every year. So.
Don't ever ask our opinion about the numbers and how many you're catching and that kind of stuff.
Your data is going to be skewed with us, yeah.
I do know that coming towards winding down in my career, and I've seen fisheries deplete and come back, but this one just meant it was in my heart.
Right.
I had to see this saved, and if I stood back and watched, I'd never forgive myself. And I'm very proud to have my name as part of helping save that fishery.
Yeah, and a lot of people out there speak so highly of you, and they directed this podcast to you. You have to speak to Frank Davis. So thank you so much.
Thanks for all you've done, Frank, and thanks for being the leader of
you're very
conservation Boca Grande.
Hey, it's a pleasure talking to you, and especially sharing my views about, if nothing would have happened, who knows? If we wouldn't have done anything, what would have happened?
Right.
If it would have continued to go on in this fiasco, it would have been a nightmare.
Right.
But there's still plenty of boats and still plenty of fish, and everybody's having a good time.
There you
Awesome.
go.
That's what
That's what it's all about.
That's right.
Well, thanks, Frank.
Thank you, buddy.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. All right.
What I saw is West Side Story. What I saw, it's just a